Sir Isaac Newton. This is the guy that started it all. Newton, one of the greatest physicists who ever lived, born on Christmas in 1642. He didn't have the greatest childhood. His mother was pregnant with Newton at the time that Newton's father passed away. His mother wished to remarry, but because women could not keep property, the property was sent back to Newton's family. And basically the mother was left at the mercy of marrying trying to think of the term, the priest in the Anglican church at the time, but the priest didn't want her children. So young Isaac was sent to his grandparents' farm, and basically that's where he grew up. At first he was not a very good student. He was mediocre at best. However, one of his teachers noticed his genius very early on, encouraged him to go to the University of Cambridge, and that's where he attended, I believe it's Trinity College, for 5 years, and then during this time was actually elevated to the faculty member, and eventually was installed as Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. Now, universities, colleges were very different back then. You would start as a student, but depending on how you progressed, you could be transitioned very easily to faculty, with experience. Now, Newton does most of his brilliant work in the plague years, when he is basically sent back to his family's farm when London shuts down with the plague. He returns back to his farm, does lots of work in mathematics, lots of work in physics, and then eventually takes this 2 years of his life where the university was shut down. Isn't that amazing? History repeats itself. And put together the Principia with his theories about optics, gravity, and motion. Now, later in Newton's life, it's really amazing. He did most of his work in 2 years. He developed calculus, he developed mechanics, he developed theories of optics, all in 2 years. And the rest of his life, he's doing almost like odd jobs. He was elected to the prestigious Royal Society. This is basically a math and science group that would, discuss important issues of math and science. He did this because he invented the reflecting telescope, which became a big improvement over the refracting telescope. He was eventually elected to Parliament, didn't really do much there. But when he was appointed to the Royal Mint, he solved a huge problem of counterfeiting, and not many people know this, actually prevented the partial collapse of England's monetary system. With counterfeiting, there's a lot of problems with people's trust in what was real money and what was counterfeit, and Newton was able to solve the problem of the counterfeiting and actually determine who was responsible for it. Again, some of his studies involved finding out that light was made of many different colors, or at least white light could be broken down into individual colors using a prism. He was credited with discovering the first mirror-based telescope, which is really the basis for all telescopes that are research quality today. He invented calculus. He basically needed a new form of math to go along with his discoveries of mechanics. Now, although Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz also invented a form of calculus, the two are co-credited for simultaneously and independently of one another creating calculus. So if you're taking calculus and you hate it, Newton's half at fault there. Newton came up with the universal law of gravitation. Basically, this became the basis of how the planets were kept in orbit around the sun, and really how most of the universe is held together. Now, in this early part were concerned mostly of Newton's principles of motion. In this chapter in particular, we talk about Newton's first law of motion. But actually, Newton just basically repackaged what Galileo had done already. And even Newton said, I've stood on the shoulders of giants in order to see farther. When Newton came up with his Principia, he simply noted 3 laws on which motion was governed. He correctly attributed it to Galileo, but he never called them Newton's laws. It wasn't until later, due to the fame of the Principia, that we said it's Newton's first law, but really it should be called Newton and Galileo's first law of motion. Okay? Again, the laws of motion. There are 3 of Newton's laws of motion. The law of inertia. An object at rest tends to stay at rest. An object in motion tends to stay in motion unless acted on by a net force. The other 2 laws we'll talk about later on. Newton's first law of motion is very important because it basically says an object at rest will remain at rest if we add up all the forces and they equal 0. This is the basis behind civil engineering. Think about a tall structure such as the Empire State Building. Okay? All the forces acting on it and within it have to balance out to 0. Gravity wants to pull it down, the internal supports push it up. The wind wants to push it side to side. The internal supports have to oppose those forces. So in this building, civil engineers will design this such that it can take all the external forces and oppose them with internal support forces. This is true for anything that we design. In civil engineering, you're just basically trying to make all the forces equal 0 under all reasonable conditions. Okay? Ever hear that something is rated for hurricane force winds? Well, some civil engineer has done the calculations to see how much of a wind load that structure will have in the case of, certain wind conditions. Bridges, they all obey Newton's first law. This is the Brooklyn Bridge, of course, and it was designed by Roebling, who was in the steel industry, and this was a revolution at the time. Up until this point, to create a bridge, we would typically use arches, okay? And arches were nice because they could be made out of stone, they could be made out of cement, and they directed all the forces to be compression. Now the problem with the Brooklyn Bridge is it had to be clear, okay, across the river, and it had to be well above the river. To build an arch this large would have been, well, prohibitively costly. So basically, Roebling thought, okay, I have this, road surface, okay? Gravity wants to pull it down. I need to pull it up. So his ingenious solution to this was to suspend a huge, massive set of master cables. Smaller cables would then fan out from the master cable and from the tower, and literally, as gravity would try to pull this road deck downward, the cables would pull it upward. So, force downward, force upward, we add the 2 vectors together, they're equal and opposite. This bridge will stand as long as we don't overload it. And again, we see the beauty of this design. The upward force from the towers would be transmitted to the cables. The cables would pull this way and this way equally so that the tower didn't experience any net force in the horizontal direction. It was made out of steel with a stone veneer, and basically this kept the forces all compressional, where the tower was very strong against that compressional force. Towers do very well against the force of gravity. They don't do so well against lateral forces. In other structures, we use trusses, and the idea of the truss is basically create opposing force, supporting forces that will go against any force that will act on it. The force of gravity wants to pull things down. The wind loads will want to push it laterally. Earthquakes will also create their own forces on here. The beauty of a truss is the triangular shapes that are embedded in the truss cannot change their shape without changing the length of the truss members. Okay? The steel, which are used in the trusses shown here, and even the wood are very good against compression and tension. Okay? Trusses convert all forces to compression and tension, and thus they're very strong. They're also very light because most of the truss is just open space. So you'll see trusses in things like the George Washington Bridge, which uses the cable system that we saw in Roeblin's Brooklyn Bridge. But again, not as much material needed to be used here because the towers themselves were truss structures. And again, you'll see many different trusses used in different buildings, some for houses, some for larger buildings. Even flat trusses are used in the floors because they're very strong, they're very light, they're less expensive than creating solid structures. Some structures are even three-dimensional. Here we have space structures, and instead of being just individual triangles, they are triangles which are melded together in the form of a tetrahedron. Here you see the Bank of China Tower, which is a very interesting set of trusses and tetrahedrons. Again, you can't change the shape of these, so you can't collapse it without actually changing the length of the side members. Understanding Newton's first law, understanding the load forces that are on a building, is important not only for building a structure, but also imploding a structure. This is an old dome stadium that was in Seattle, decades ago, which had outlived its usefulness, and they wished to bring it down. If you look on the ribs of this dome, you'll actually see these shape charges which have been placed on it. The idea of a shape charge isn't so much to simply destroy something. A shape charge actually has metal in the shape of a chevron that when high explosives are detonated, it converts the chevron into a jet of metal. So a shape charge is more or less a cutting device. Okay? Sounds strange as you're cutting things with explosives, but that's what they mean by shape charge. They've shaped the explosion such that it puts its energy into a jet of molten metal, and this molten metal will go through concrete without any problem at all. But they time it such that the building will implode with the center falling inward, and that pulls everything else with it. Instead of using one massive charge to blow it up, these many charges that go off sequentially, instead of one shock wave, you get many tiny shock waves as the building comes down. Now you can see where it was located. There are lots of buildings which could have been damaged if this wasn't imploded properly. Another example of Newton's first law is a seatbelt tensioner. The seatbelt tensioner is probably the most annoying device in a car. It locks up when it senses a slowing down motion or deceleration. The way it works is this. There's a large inertial block which is connected to a ratchet. As the car slows down, the inertia of the block pulls it forward. That causes the rod to insert itself into the ratchet, and it locks it. Okay? Again, if you ever felt the seatbelt lock, that probably means that the rod went in there when it wasn't supposed to. Okay? So that's Newton's first law. And again, the idea is inertia. Objects, if they're at rest, they will tend to stay at rest. If they're in motion, they will continue in motion unless there's some force acting on it. Okay? Sounds really simple. No force, no movement. But really, when we think about civil engineering, you've got to think about every force that could conceivably act on a building, a bridge, or a tower. Okay? And use that and the strength of materials to design the most efficient structure possible.